Hello students, in the last module we have discussed about some schools of psychology like structuralism, functionalism and psychoanalysis. You have learnt about what should be the subject matter of psychology and what techniques we should use to understand human behavior according to those schools of perspective, according to those schools of psychology. In this module, let us understand two more schools of psychology, very popular schools, that is behaviorism and Gestalt. Let us start with behaviorism. Behaviorism became a dominant school of thought during the 1950s. It was based upon the work of thinkers like John B. Watson, Ivan Pavlov and B.F. Skinner. Behaviorism was the most influential school of thought in American psychology until the 1960s. It remains a major force even in modern psychology, largely because of the profound influence of B.F. Skinner. John B. Watson criticized the views of structuralists and functionalists and proposed a radically new approach to psychology that rejected the subjectivity of both structuralism and functionalism. So, this new school, that is behaviorism, redefined psychology as the science of behavior. The concept behaviorism was coined by Watson, and this school of psychology confines itself to the study of behavior because behavior is observable, measurable and trainable. That is, understanding the behavior can be objective and scientific. It excluded the study of ideas, emotions and the consideration of inner mental experience and activity in general. The emphasis from Watson's perspective should only be on overt or observable behavior, but not on covert behavior or any other mental processes. J.B. Watson is called as father of behaviorism. Behaviorism suggests that all behavior can be explained by environmental causes rather than by internal forces. Behaviorists believed that human behavior can be understood by examining the relationship between stimuli, that is events in the environment, and responses, that is observable behavior. Behaviorists view that environment impacts the behavior, and this can be understood from the Watson's famous statement, "Give me a dozen healthy infants, well formed and my own specified world to bring them up in, and I will guarantee to take anyone at random and train him to become any type of specialist I might select, doctor, a lawyer, artist, merchant chief, and yes, even beggarman and thief, regardless of his talents, penchants, tendencies, abilities, occasions and race of his ancestors." So, this famous statement by Watson, we can understand that how environment will be impacting our human behavior, how our personality can be formed based upon the environmental factors. Behaviorists believe that any person could potentially be trained to perform any task regardless of things like genetic background, personality traits and internal thoughts, that is within the limits of their physical capabilities. All it takes is the right conditioning. Skinner agreed with Watson that concepts like mind, consciousness and feelings are neither objective nor measurable, and therefore not appropriate subject matter for psychology. Further, Skinner argued that these concepts are not needed to explain behavior. One can explain behavior by analyzing the conditions that are present before a behavior occurs and then analyzing the consequences that follow the behavior. According to Skinner, behavior is a consequence of reinforcement, that is a stimulus that increases the probability of performing behaviors, and punishment, that is a stimulus that decreases such probability. Theories of learning, including classical conditioning and operant conditioning, were the focus of a great deal of research. Behaviorism is a theory of learning based on the idea that all behaviors are acquired through conditioning. Conditioning therefore occurs through interaction with the environment, which then makes behaviorists believe that our responses to environmental stimuli shape our behaviors. The behavioral school of psychology had a significant influence on the field of psychology, and many of the ideas and techniques that emerged from this school of thought are still widely used today. For example, behavioral training, token economies, aversion therapy and other techniques are frequently used in psychotherapy and behavior modification programs. In behaviorism, the organism is seen as responding to conditions, that is stimuli set by outer environment and by inner biological processes. Classical behaviorism was dedicated to proving that phenomena formerly believed to require introspective study like thinking, imagery, emotions or feeling might be understood in terms of stimulus and response. Classical behaviorism was further characterized by a strict determinism based on the belief that every response is elicited by specific stimulus. A derivative form of classical behaviorism known as neo-behaviorism evolved from 1930 through the late 1940s. In this approach, psychologists attempted to translate the general methodology prescribed by Watson into a detailed, experimentally based theory of adaptive behavior. This era was dominated by learning theorists like Clark L. Hull and B.F. Skinner. Skinner's thought was the direct descendant of Watson's intellectual heritage and became dominant in the field after the mid-1950s. B.F. Skinner suggested that covert behavior like cognition and emotion is subject to the same controlling variables as observable behavior, which became the basis for his philosophy called radical behaviorism. While Watson and Ivan Pavlov investigated how conditioned neutral stimuli elicit reflexes in respondent conditioning, Skinner assessed the reinforcement histories of the discriminative, that is antecedent stimuli that emits behavior, and this technique popularly known as operant conditioning. Skinner's operant conditioning was heavily influenced by the law of effects principle of reinforcement postulated by Edward Thorndike. Other important behaviorists like Hull influenced Kenneth W. Spence, Neil Miller, who claimed that neuroscience is the most productive avenue in psychological research. Cognitive theorists like Edward Tolman and Edwin R. Guthrie, Tolman and others brought about a liberalization of strict behaviorist doctrine. The posture toward objectivism remained fundamentally the same even while admitting the existence of intervening, that is mental variables, accepting verbal reports and branching into areas such as perception. A natural outgrowth of behaviorist theory was behavior therapy, which rose to prominence after World War II and focused on modifying observable behavior rather than the thoughts and feelings of the patient as in psychoanalysis. In this approach, emotional problems are thought to result from faulty acquired behavior patterns or the failure to learn effective responses. The aim of behavior therapy, also known as behavior modification, is therefore to change behavior patterns. The application of radical behaviorism, known as applied behavior analysis, was used in a variety of contexts, including applied animal behavior and organization behavior management to the treatment of mental disorders like autism and substance abuse. While behaviorism and cognitive schools of psychological thought do not agree theoretically, they have complemented each other in the cognitive behavior therapies, which have demonstrated utility in treating certain pathologies like simple phobias, PTSD, that is post traumatic stress disorder, and mood disorders. Nevertheless, the strict behaviorist view of Watson was in no way superior to the narrow emphasis of structuralists and functionalists on mental life alone. Indeed, many aspects of human experience like thinking, intrinsic motivation, creativity lie outside a strict behavioral definition of psychology. These two must be studied in order to gain a more complete understanding of the individual. Now, let us go to another school of psychology, that is Gestalt school of psychology. This Gestalt school of psychology is based upon the idea that we experience things as unified wholes. This approach to psychology began in Germany and Austria during the late 19th century in response to molecular approach of structuralism. Instead of breaking down thoughts and behavior to their smallest elements, the Gestalt psychologists believed that you must look at the whole of experience. According to the Gestalt thinkers, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. The Gestalt psychologists, notably Max Wertheimer, 𝗪𝗏 and Wolfgang Kohler, emphasized that individuals perceive objects and patterns as whole units, and the perceived whole is more than the sum of its parts. The German word Gestalt roughly means whole, form, pattern or configuration. So, the design you see here is entirely made up of broken circles. However, as the Gestalt psychologists discovered, our perceptions have a powerful tendency to form meaningful patterns. Because of this tendency, you will probably see a triangle in this design even though it is only an illusion. Your whole perceptual experience exceeds the sum of its parts. The earlier Gestalt work concerned with perception with particular emphasis on visual perceptual organization as explained by the phenomenon of illusion. The publication of Czech-born psychologist Max Wertheimer's experimental studies of the perception of movement in 1912 marks the founding of the Gestalt school. In this book, Wertheimer reported the result of a study on apparent movement conducted in Frankfurt, Germany, with psychologists Wolfgang Kohler and 𝗪𝗏. Together, these three formed the core of the Gestalt school for the next few decades, and by the mid 1930s, all had become professors in the United States. In 1912, Wertheimer discovered the phi phenomenon, that is, an optical illusion in which stationary objects shown in rapid succession transcending the threshold at which they can be perceived separately appear to move. The explanation of this phenomenon, also known as persistence of vision and experienced when viewing motion pictures, provided strong support for Gestalt principles. In this experiment, two light bulbs are placed a short distance apart in a dark room. The first light is flashed on and then turned off just as the second light is flashed on. As this pattern of flashing the lights on and off continues, an observer sees what appears to be a single light moving back and forth from one position to another. Gestalt said that this is the proof that people perceive wholes or patterns rather than collections of separate sensations. Under the old assumption that sensations of perceptual experience stand in one-to-one relation to physical stimuli, the effect of phi phenomenon was apparently inexplicable. However, Wadhwani understood that the perceived motion is an emergent experience not present in the stimuli in isolation, but dependent upon the relational characteristics of the stimuli. In later writings, this principle was stated as law of pregnance, meaning that the neural and perceptual organization of any set of stimuli will form as a good gestalt or whole as the prevailing conditions will allow. When we say pregnance, what is this law of pregnance means? The stimulus will be organized into as good as figure as possible. For example, look at this figure. The moment you look at this figure, how do you perceive this? In this figure, the good refers to symmetry, simplicity and regularity. The figure is perceived as a square overlapping a triangle, not a combination of several complicated shapes. Apart from this law of pregnance, other Gestalt principles which will guide us in forming our perceptions are figure and ground, law of proximity, law of similarity and law of closure. Now, what is this figure and ground? It means we tend to pay attention and perceive things in the foreground first. A stimulus will be perceived as separate from its ground. Now, what is the second law? That is proximity. Proximity means elements that are closer together will be perceived as coherent object. Then the next principle is about similarity. Elements that look similar will be perceived as part of the same form. The next principle is law of closure. It indicates that we have a tendency to fill the gaps or close the figures we perceive. We enclose a space by completing a contour and ignoring gaps in the figure. Major elaborations of the new formulation occurred within the next decades. Wadhwani, Kohler, Köfke and their students extended the Gestalt approach to problems in other areas of perception, problem solving, learning and thinking. Insight learning is another area of contribution by Kohler. Insight learning occurs when a new behavior is learned through cognitive processes rather than through interactions with the outside world. There is no gradual shaping or trial and error involved in this insight learning. Instead, internal organizational processes cause new behavior. Insight learning suggests that we learn not only by conditioning, but also by cognitive processes that cannot be directly observed. Insight learning is a form of learning as it involves a change in behavior. However, it differs from other forms of learning because the process is not observable. It can be hard to define because it is not behavioral, a characteristic that distinguishes it from most theories of learning. To demonstrate this phenomena, many experiments were conducted on chimpanzees by Kohler. Insight learning, however, does not directly involve using past experiences to solve a problem. While past experiences may help the process, an insight or novel idea is necessary to solve the problem. In humans, insight learning occurs whenever we suddenly see a problem in a new way, connect the problem to another relevant problem or solution, release past experiences that are blocking the solution, or see the problem in a larger, more coherent context. The Gestalt principles were later applied to motivation, social psychology and personality, particularly by Kurt Lewin, and to aesthetics and economic behavior. Wadhwani demonstrated that Gestalt concepts could also be used to shed light on problems in ethics, political behavior and the nature of truth. Gestalt psychologist's traditions continued in the perceptual investigations undertaken by Rudolf Arnhem and Hans Wallach in the United States. When the Nazis came to power in Germany in the 1930s, the Gestalt school disbanded and its most prominent members immigrated to the United States. Today, the fundamental concept underlying Gestalt psychology, that the mind interprets experiences in predictable ways rather than simply reacts to them, is central to cognitive psychologists' ideas about learning, memory, problem solving and even psychotherapy. Gestalt psychology was in part an attempt to add a humanistic dimension to what was considered a sterile approach to the scientific study of mental life. Gestalt psychology further sought to encompass the qualities of form, meaning and value that prevailing psychologists had either ignored or presumed to fall outside the boundaries of science. Let us summarize what we have studied in this module. We studied about behaviorism as a school of psychology, which emphasizes that environmental factors will influence our behavior, will shape our behavior. Hence, to bring about a change in the human behavior, we need to change the environmental forces. According to behaviorists, we can always understand behavior in terms of a response to a stimulus, and factors like reinforcement and punishment, as postulated by Skinner, also play an important role in shaping the new behaviors or in learning the new behaviors. The next school that we have covered in this module is about Gestalt school of psychology. In the previous module, we tried to understand mind in terms of different components, elements, but Gestalts opposed the view of structuralists and functionalists, and they said the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. We can understand anything by focusing on the whole rather than dividing them into parts. The main focus was on perception. They laid important principles of perception which guide us to perceive what is happening around or how to understand the things around. Similarly, many researches were conducted on the concept of 5 phenomena and insightful learning as postulated by Kohler.